So rather than being normative, I want to take a, press this, I want to take a what's called value neutral approach. Now I'm not naive, I know there's no objectivity, I'm even doubting if there is neutrality, but, and Weber himself acknowledged there is no such thing in the questions that we ask, but once we do our research, we try to be distant and as good as we can. It's a kind of form of an intellectual sublimation, if you want. So that's the, so rather than making ethical statements, and along with it endorsing certain goals, I'm trying to analyze how, when, and who is attaching ethical claims to what. Okay, at what periods do people say something is good or not, and so on and so forth. And that brings me to another kind of preliminary point, and that is there's a growing tendency to blur the line between the observer's perspective, us, and the actor's perspective. And that's not just an academic matter, that has real political consequences. It was, I think, Anthony Giddens, I'm sure there were other philosophers who said that before him, who calls this a double hermeneutic process. That is to say, the idea that social science concepts, or for that matter, any concepts, don't just describe the world, but they also actively shape it. Not everybody, not every utterance that we do. So I think we should take some kind of optimism or confidence out of that, because we all sit here, how are we going to disseminate, who's going to hear this, how are we going to disseminate it? And I think we are actually not, I mean, we don't have the big megaphone, but when we stick to it, I think our concepts can eventually infiltrate, or I shouldn't say, contribute to society. So now that I kind of did the throat clearing, let's try and dive in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on a conceptual framework that I've been developing over the years, largely in cooperation with my collaborator, then collaborator Nathan Schneider. And I assure you this is not a narcissistic exercise where I want to talk about myself, but that's because historically speaking, our interest in the historical transformations of Holocaust memory and the claim of a cosmopolitan memory are very timely confined, and they coincided, and maybe they're even coextensive, with the emergence of the human rights regime. We know we have human rights since the UN and the declarations, but human rights really only started in the 70s and became, if you want, a normative global imperative in the 1990s. And I think it was a global imperative, not to say that human rights violations, of course, took place left and right, but people at least had to pretend that they were abiding by it. I think we are past that moment now, unfortunately, but I'll address that a little later. So, I bring it up because the cosmopolitan memory thesis has sparked some fascinating instructive debates, especially around issues of universalism and its relationship to particularism. And those debates, at least inadvertently, also raise, of course, ethical questions. Tak. Okay. So back in the late 90s and early 2000s, human rights were at the center of global politics. It wasn't just a buzzword, it was the foundation of a whole system of governance that stretched beyond national borders. Think of it as a human rights regime, that is to say a network of international agreements, legal frameworks and declarations that shaped expectations worldwide. Again, I want to make sure that you don't misunderstand me as some naive person who thinks that politics were guided by human rights, but everybody was talking the talk, including autocrats. Okay, this was not an unusual moment. So we saw this in action to the rise of ad hoc tribunals, the creation, and tellingly, talk about Eurocentrism. When did we all of a sudden become worried about this? And when did we talk about ethnic cleansing? It was a war in Europe, the Yugoslavian conflict, the Balkan conflict. In the meantime, there were many, many other conflicts that could have raised this, but here we're outside Europe, we don't care. Right, so the Yugoslavian war was a pivoting point. Subsequently, the creation of the International Court, increasing global commitment to accountability and justice. At the same time, we found that something else was happening, namely the emergence of a kind of cosmopolitanized memory around the Holocaust. Okay, all these pieces, all these places all of a sudden everybody was attending to it. It became embedded in a history, in a legal and cultural narratives across Europe and North America, and eventually expanded worldwide. But then things changed. Roughly after 9/11 and other major geopolitical shifts, human rights discourse became increasingly secularized. The push for cosmopolitanism, once a powerful unifying force of sorts, started meeting serious resistance. Governments and political movements began doubling down on national sovereignty, often framing human rights as an external, even an anti-national force. Okay? You can think of examples yourselves, not so complicated. What has started as a universalist project was now under attack, not just from nationalist movements, but later also from the post-colonial left. I'll talk about that in a moment. So, now quick note, I'm using the kind of post-colonial left and national right as a shorthand. Obviously there are important distinctions, and I know there are right-wing conservatives, there are far-right populists, and just outright fascists. So the dominance of universalist thinking has become a key subject of critique. The whole questions of comparability, how we compare different histories and injustices, has now been re-examined through a post-colonial lens. And this shift is significant. Issues that were once ignored or silenced have now become central debates, challenging long-standing intellectual and political assumptions. Since the mid-2010s, post-colonial scholars have been making a strong case that the human rights regime, rather than being the great equalizer, actually reinforces global power imbalances. Some people like Peng Chia even argue that it's just a modern version of the old civilizing mission, as a way of the West to impose its values on the rest of the world. So where does that leave us? Well, while human rights were once seen as a way to unite the world, today they are at the center of some of the most heated political debates, caught between global aspirations and national realities. And I'll come back to that. So let me briefly try and illustrate the issue. Before moving forward and talking about this cosmopolitan framework, it's very important to make a distinction, namely between cosmopolitanism as an ism, an aspirational ideology, something people actively promote and advocate for. That is the actor's perspective, and in some cases also philosophers argue that. Cosmopolitanization, on the other hand, is a process. It's something that happens, whether we intend it or not, or whether we like it or not. It's about how political, cultural, and social forces shape our world. That is the observer perspective. Okay, and cosmopolitanization is not some progressive idea. What I'm trying to present here is I'm trying to use it as a time diagnostic, heuristic form for the current period, which might be ending in many ways. So you might think that this is already not relevant. Although I still make the claim, and I will elaborate on that, that in order to understand Trump and the likes of him, you have to understand the dominance of the cosmopolitan period. In other words, I think neo-nationalism needs to be understood as a reaction to, and so on and so forth. And this is beyond, but incorporates universalism and particularism. So rather than treating cosmopolitanism and human rights as fixed, unchanging ideas, I want to take a historical perspective because these concepts have evolved. Human rights, with its claim to universalism, has gone through multiple transformations of the past 75 years. The same goes for cosmopolitanism. It's been reshaped countless times since its origins in ancient Greece. So the universalist version of cosmopolitanism, championed by Enlightenment thinkers like Kant and recently by scholars like Martha Nussbaum, has often been framed as an either-or proposition. You're either a cosmopolitan or a nationalist. You're either universalist or particularist. But what if that's the wrong way to think about it? I'm just raising this. So sociologist Ulrich Beck offers a different perspective. He describes cosmopolitanization as a dynamic, non-linear process, one where the global and the local, the universal and the particular, don't cancel each other out, but instead shape and influence each other. In other words, Cosmopolitanization isn't just some abstract utopian concept, it's a heuristic tool. It helps us make sense of how the world keeps changing. It allows us to trace historical shifts and examine how global ideas and local realities interact, adapt, and redefine each other again and again and again. And that's exactly what I want to explore next. So I'm taking the Holocaust, I'm taking the Holocaust memory as a case study because that's what I've written about and that's what I know, and to make arguments about how the landscape of commemoration has shifted. Okay, so I'm using that in order to show some other things. Now, the cosmopolitan memory thesis has sparked its fair share of debate. Some critics argue it's overly optimistic, teleological, or too closely tied to universalist Kantian ideas. That's because they don't make the distinction between cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitanization as a social scientific tool, or whatever you want to call that. What these critics overlook is that our analysis of cosmopolitanization is not about some abstract universalist idea. This is not about ontology. It's about history. When we talk about the cosmopolitanization of Holocaust memory, we're not saying that there is a single, unified, or inevitable way of remembering it. The Holocaust does not become some totalizing, one-size-fits-all signifier with the same meaning everywhere. Instead, what we're talking about is an encounter between the global and the local, and the universal and the particular. It's in this interaction that Holocaust memory has evolved, shaped by different cultures, political contexts, and historical moments. And in some cases, this memory has been turned into an ethical imperative, something that different groups and nations have claimed, adapted, and reshaped. This has led to shifting interpretations of how the Holocaust is commemorated, understood, and used in different parts of the world. Now, too often, as I said before, these tensions of global and global are framed as either-or questions. But we reject that binary view. Instead, we draw on Roland Robertson, who was one of the early people who kind of conceptualized the early globalization scholars, if you want. I should backtrack and say my interest in Holocaust memory came out of the question, how does memory change in the age of globalization, okay? Or does it change or not? So that's the kind of what brought me to this. And so Robertson says basically he has this term globalization, which is, I think, it's a neologism, but it comes from Japanese business language or something like this. And it's a mix of global and local. Simply put, globalization describes how global ideas, symbols, and cultural narratives are adapted to fit local contexts. It's a response to the idea that globalization inevitably erases local cultures or flattens everything. Okay, that's really not the case. In many ways, I would say even, and I don't want to digress, but globalization has not only not erased locality, I would say locality is reinforced and has gotten even more traction because of that, right? I mean, who in the 1950s would advertise, I don't know, home-cooked food? Nobody, on the contrary. Now, I mean, this is a trivial example. So the locality is not erased by that. There's a reaction to it, right? Precisely because the global is so powerful. All right. And this is a central issue for how we understand Holocaust memory. So the evolution of it. When we first developed the cosmopolitan memory thesis in the late 1990s, the world was in a very particular historical moment, right? International laws, human rights laws were expanding. I mentioned that already. The Holocaust became more global. I have a slide here. I mean, what does, let me see, you can pick Northern Macedonia have to do with the Holocaust? Well, actually, they have something to do with it, but Taiwan, I mean, what is that? How do you explain this, if not by this kind of cosmopolitan moment? Not good or bad, you know, but otherwise there's really no explanation. In Eastern Europe, it was clear. Ascendance to the EU was predicated on, you know, being human rights, subscribing to human rights, and in that case, it meant, you know, of course, Holocaust memory we adopted. It was also interesting that they did it because it allowed them to not talk about collaboration in many ways, right? So it's like, hey, we are good people. We are not doing anything about it. But it was really an entry ticket to the EU. Let me just quote one thing from we wrote this book in 2001, so you can see how the 90s loom large. The Holocaust has been confronted by various forces which have attempted to universalize it, to particularize it, and to nationalize it. But recently this memory, recently would be in the 90s, this memory has continued to exist on a global level. Its strength as a global collective memory has been powered and maintained precisely through the theory interaction between the local and the global. We argue that this dual process of particularization and universalization has produced a symbol of transnational, or rather cosmopolitan solidarity that is based on a cosmopolitanized memory. One that does not replace national collective memories, but exists as their horizon, for that particular moment, at least on a declarative level. In other words, Holocaust memory hasn't settled into a single universal meaning, but it vacillates. And this is what makes it such a powerful case study. It shows us that commemoration isn't static, it evolves, it's contested, it's negotiated, and most importantly, it's not just about the past, but primarily, I would say, about the present and the future. Now, how does this play into today's political climate? Well, I think that's where things get even more interesting. Over the last 2 decades, there has been a lot of debate about the idea of global memory and what it really means. People raised concerns, for instance, that turning the Holocaust into a universal symbol could risk stripping it of its historical context. Right? You make it like kind of a general cipher for human rights. What about the history of the Holocaust? What about the victims? You know, we talked about that earlier. The problem of abstraction. I didn't have time to say that. I think abstraction is necessary in order to make a memorial successful. I mean, of course you have to have historical specificity, but if it's not abstract, then your chance that it resonates with a broader public are very slim, right? So abstraction is not necessarily a bad thing, but it was definitely criticized around these issues. And that raises the question, who are memorials really for, and how do they shift depending on who is addressed? To understand this better, we need to look at how memory cultures have changed. I'm mainly talking about Europe. That's because A, that's what I know, and B, because Europe and North America has been very dominant in the diffusion of all kinds of values. You like it or not, that's not the point, but we can't dismiss that, okay? You can be against the Enlightenment because it's a Western idea, but you can't be against the power. And you have to realize the power that stands behind. Again, we come back to power. So it's not about, I'm not endorsing it or anything like that, but there's a good reason to be Eurocentric in this case. Yeah, so back when nation states were at their peak, the goal of memory and memorials was to create a sense of unity, right? That transcends differences within the nation. Think about Italy, unification. Italy is unified, and then, I don't know, it was Garibaldi or somebody said, now we have Italy, now we have to make Italians. Same with the French. I mean, the French only became French in the late 19th century. Sorry to say, never mind the French Revolution, that didn't do it. There's a wonderful book from peasants to Frenchmen by Eugene Weber. It's a little bit functionalist, but it's very good, I think. And there he talks about these things, right? I mean, think about the United States. And right now, what does it mean to be American? When have we become American? And are we, I'm not so sure we are really sure that we are all American. And so, I mean, you know, this contestation goes on and on. In some cases, it's through war and other violent means. So today, memorials don't just celebrate victories. We used to live in a post-heroic age that, by the way, did not come necessarily after World War II. That's the interesting thing. Here you have World War I, all these terrible deaths, and then 20 years later, or no, 30 years later, you mobilize people to do the same thing again. It's unbelievable. I mean, I think we don't give nationalism enough credit. As an ism, it has been extremely powerful. I mean, and Benedict Anderson opens his book, Imagine Communities. Who is willing to die for the EU? Right? As a rhetorical thing. And of course, he was wrong, because as we will see soon, people will be willing to die for the EU for all kinds of geopolitical reasons. But the point is that You still have, of course, a lot of places that celebrate heroes, and I think that's going to come back in major forms. But I still think that you cannot undo what we have learned in the last 30 years and some of the things that we want to do, or at least the hero builders will have to contend with us and our narratives. You know, they can't put us away. I really don't believe that. So one of the distinctions I want to make that is kind of useful, and it doesn't really translate, is in German the differentiation between Denkmal and Mahnmal. Denkmal is essentially means monument, but it literally translates into think about it. I mean, again, Denkmal, there's no American English equivalent, whereas Mahnmal, on the other hand, translates to admonish, right? And refers to people's ability and memorials that serve as reminders of dark chapters in history, right? It's like kind of beware. So there are two different, I mean, they're not necessarily inconsistent, but there are two of those. So let me go back to the Cosmopolitan. So this is what I mean. Think about it, admonish. Not sure if I captured the right ones, but clearly the one is a conventional thing. We know it commemorates something. The other one, there are people, you know, we have to get closer. We have to understand what's going on. So the thesis has sparked a lot of interest and debates. And the clearest opposition to it was, well, but the nation state still matters, and nationhood matters, and of course, who said otherwise? But you know, that's the problem when we do certain things in our work sometimes, is misappropriated, misunderstood, and we will see a lot of that in the next 4 years. You can't control that. I think it's a productive thing in academia, not productive in politics in many ways. So, Cosmopolitan, the fact that the West has had a dominant role in shaping global cultural models, it doesn't really flatten everything. Cosmopolitanism is a process that also steers resistance. I think, again, neo-populist, populist, neo-national right in Europe, it's all about the cosmopolitan elites, the globalists. If you remember that rhetoric, which was kind of powerful in the last American elections, that's really, so a target, so they thrive on that, rather than, because there's nothing else they can thrive on. What are they going to thrive on? Right, there's nothing what can a nationalist today say other than being anachronistic? Make America great again? I am all for it. Which America is that? You know, and you don't hear about that. I mean, we know what they mean, but it's not entirely clear. And I'm saying that because the rise of neo-nationalism is a direct response to cosmopolitanism, much like how nationalism itself in its period had to contend with monarchical forces or local forces and other things. Nationalism was hard labor, you know. People, I would say, started working on that in the mid-19th century. It took a long time for them to succeed. So let me just point out, I'm really not going with the slides here. Sorry. Let me point out some resistance or contestations to the cosmopolitan perspective, which I think is very instructive. So as we look at the rise of identity politics and demands for a right to particularity, especially over the last couple of decades, these tensions have added another layer to today's debates. It is clear that memory, identity, and history are more complex than ever before, and the battles over how we remember our past will only continue to shape the future. In that respect, I actually like the fact that memorials are controversial, because that's the conversation you want to have. So a memorial that is very how should I say, clear and denotative, I'm not so sure if it fulfills all the purposes. So, and the identity politics are important. Let me just give you an example, and no offense to the anthropologists, please. The American Anthropological Association, the AAA, has evolved in its stance on human rights, quite interestingly. Back in 1999, the AAA reaffirmed its commitment to human rights, but also stressed the importance of collective rights, which is a huge concern for social scientists, and it's a good thing. The shift shows a key challenge: how to balance respecting different cultures and their diversity with upholding universal human rights. In the past, the AAA thought of human rights as a Western or colonial imposition. In fact, in 1947, they voted against the Universal Declaration, and they argued that moral values were culturally relative, meaning any attempt to make human rights universal would just be biased. But by 2020, the AAA issued a new statement on human rights, its third such statement, reflecting how the conversation has changed over time. The first statement, made by Melville Herskovits in 1947, criticized the UN's effort to push universal rights, seeing them as promoting Western ideals like individualism and private property, which Herskovits argued were rooted in colonial power structures. Today, the AAA is still grappling with how universal rights intersect with cultural, national, and social class identities. And that's completely okay, but now it has taken on a new kind of dimension, and I would say in part because post-colonial and decolonial frames have gotten certainly traction in academia, but also can be deciphered in some of the rhetoric of a lot of social movements. So since the 2010s, especially with the post-colonial shift, there's been a growing push to rethink the singularity of the Holocaust as the defining memory of victimhood. There's been increasing demand to broaden the conversation to include other histories of suffering, starting with genocide studies and expanding to include colonial history. I'll come back to that. This broader conversation is where post-colonial and more recently decolonial approaches to memorialization come into play. Post-colonial scholars are focused on how power imbalances between Western universalism and non-Western particularism are still shaped by the legacy of colonialism. Decolonial approaches go further, questioning not just the persistence of colonial power structures, but also the foundations of knowledge itself and the systems that uphold it. A key part of this critique is the rejection of universalism as a way for the West to impose its standards while making particular cultural perspectives invisible. That's a current discussion that we are having in a, I think, very uninspiring way, namely in the context of cancel culture, categorical, and so on and so forth. I don't find that productive at all. From a post-colonial perspective, the dominance of Holocaust memory is a major issue. Post-colonialists criticize the ways in which Holocaust memory operates as a screen memory. Okay? Holocaust memory is often universalized and treated as a singular, that is ontological, rather than a unique, that is historically event in history. That's a big difference, okay? And I don't know, but if you're in a university that has a Holocaust studies and genocide studies, and how do we name it? Do we name it Holocaust studies? Is it a chair for Holocaust studies or for Holocaust and genocide? These are huge debates, okay? They get very loud. And this can, and the screen memory part is, I think, very informative and helpful because it can obscure the experiences of other genocides and instances of mass violence, particularly those that have occurred in colonized or marginalized contexts. This universalization can reinforce hierarchies of suffering and prioritize certain victims' experience over others. We haven't raised that yet at the conference, but the victimhood and competition of victimhood is very much part of the memorialization and the context, okay? During your talk, I found an interesting thing when, I don't know who asked, what about the white lynchings? I think your response was very clear. It's completely different. These were people who were lynched because they were criminals or they were hated, they were outlaws, not as a group, not as a categorical instance. But nonetheless, the competition of victimhood is a real obstacle to many things. So the concern is that when the historic Holocaust becomes a universal symbol of evil, it pushes other histories to the side. And some scholars and activists argue that the West's focus on Holocaust memory is part of a broader strategy to confront its own violent violent colonial past. And I think everybody who has looked at French historiography or Belgium historiography, nothing to say but the Brits and the study of empire, of course there's a lot of good stuff out there, but there's also a lot of silencing of that, you know. So there's a new revisionism in all these complicated cases that have toxic pasts, as we call it, but the dominant narratives are still somewhat problematic. So, post-colonial critics argue that the focus on Holocaust memory is Eurocentric, representing a hierarchy of civilizations. They claim that human rights, as championed by the West, have become a tool for neo-colonialism, justifying interventions in the global South. The idea is that Western moral standards are often imposed on other countries without regard for local context. And this has sparked a lot of resistance from weaker states, especially in the global South. Because they say these universal practices, they see them as asymmetrical and an excuse for stronger states to violate their sovereignty. So for post-colonial critics, the answer is clear. We need a more nuanced and inclusive approach to remembering trauma, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of different forms of oppression and centers marginalized voices. This means looking critically at the power dynamics involved in how we create, represent, and remember history, or how we commemorate, to ensure more just and equitable practices of remembrance and reconciliation. Now, I don't know how many, I don't think, and I think this is a perspective that has had tremendous success, has been very forceful. Why am I saying this? I'm not a post-colonial scholar, but I subscribe to all of this, and listening to the conference, we are all post-colonial scholars without knowing it. Some of you might be deliberate post-colonial scholars, but de facto, what have we been saying other than that, right? So I think that's a sign of a success in academia maybe, but also in social movements. There are also problems with it, granted, but it's very clear that the point has been made, and we heard it loud and clearly, I think. One thing that has become clear is the growing role of the scholar activists working on issues like systemic racism, Black Lives Matter, climate change, Fridays for Future, and social justice have brought new urgency to the relationship between academia and activism. And many of these scholar activists challenge traditional memorial practices. They're not just pushing to change what we remember, but how we remember it, turning Denkmäler into Mahnmäler. It isn't just about rejecting old values, it's about recognizing the victims of past violence, in some cases holding the perpetrators accountable. Let's now turn our attention to those who have traditionally been seen as the victimizers, the perpetrators, and how some of these neo-nationalists are adopting victimhood as part of their own narrative. I mean, think of this is really the success of, quote unquote, the Cosmopolitan moment. I mean, you know, the poor white Afrikaners in South Africa. I mean, we have to give them refugee. It's clear, you know, and nobody can doubt that. So, and it's amazing the adoption of the right of leftist lingo and of certain things, you know. Anyway, so they are adopting these narratives and they are reshaping the conversation around cosmopolitanism and human rights. Now, unlike the left, which mostly stays within academia, unfortunately, the neo-nationalist right has political power and is shaping how we remember history through commemorations and memorials. While cosmopolitanism initially contributed to the denationalization of Europe, it has also sparked a strong push for renationalization. At this point, and looking at the map in Europe, is there any country that is not run by neo-nationalists? And worse? Czech Republic, not much longer. Somebody's waiting in the wing. Slovenia, not much longer. Certainly not the big countries. Germany barely avoided something. It's a different story. That's only because the right there is extremely stupid and they're not. No, I mean it. If they would play the Marie Le Pen game, they would have won the election, but they are not willing to dissociate themselves from neo-Nazis, which still rubs some centrist Germans the wrong way. So if they were smarter, they would be. But look at the European continent. It's completely dominated by, including the Scandinavian countries, not Finland and Norway. I think, but Denmark and Sweden, boy oh boy, it's very very telling. So that thing is over. And as I said before, what's noteworthy is how neo-nationalists are taking elements from liberal scripts and using them to push their own agenda. They're not outright rejecting identity politics. Instead, they're co-opting its language to promote exclusionary nationalism. I hope it's clear that Trumpism is a form of identity politics. Okay, we might not like it. That's, by the way, a bias I find in academia. Sociologists have studied social movements for 40 years. Only progressive movements. You know, as if social movements is a great thing. Nobody, I mean, now we do, of course, also look at other movements. We have there's a blind eye to the left to studying this. And the same is true also for identity politics, as if only the left was doing it. And a lot of this neo-nationalist frame is also framed through a civilizational lens, okay? Often contrasting what they call the Judeo-Christian values with what they perceive as threats, particularly Islam. For example, in the Netherlands, as you know, there's a right-wing, Wilders is the leader of that party, and so what have they inscribed, for instance, citizenship tests, which is mostly basically people from the Maghreb, meaning North Africa. There's a video, they have to watch a video where two men are seen walking on the beach and kissing. Europe, which until the 1970s had sodomy laws. Europe, which, I mean, you know, now, of course, you know, it's not a problem. So they're subjecting these people, and they're using a liberal script, but they're completely on the right. Okay, and so we see, and I think we see that in the US more and more and more. I don't have to give examples, you know that stuff much better than I do. So, in other words, Cosmopolitan has become this projection on which people can articulate their own political ideologies. So, looking ahead. No, okay, so this is looking ahead. Let's make America great again. Nobody, you know, nobody gives Reagan credit for that. Everybody, not everybody, but people who know, they know. But that's not Trump's thing. Not even that he can do, but that's another thing. So, looking ahead, I imagine that the work we're doing here, the good work that scholars and practitioners like all of you are contributing, will face a backlash, especially in more conservative states in the US and in federal institutions like the Smithsonian. I could have scrapped that. That's what we've heard for the last 2 days, and unfortunately even with people who already had to pay a price. Now, I think in the US, with this federal system, we're likely to see a patchwork of approaches to commemoration. To illustrate this, let's look at the planning and debates around museums and in memorials in places like Germany, the US, and Canada. These countries have had some pretty contentious debates over representation and design. Take the Berlin Memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, for example. It took only 16 years for approval and remains controversial, partly because of its abstract design and focus on Jewish victims of the Holocaust. In the US, the Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in 1993, but the National Museum of African American History and Culture didn't open until 2016. This raises some uncomfortable questions about which events are prioritized in national memory. The historian Eric Foner put it this way, and I quote, "We have a museum of the Holocaust in Washington, which is a great museum, but what would we think if the Germans put up a big museum of American slavery in Berlin and didn't have anything about the Holocaust?" Okay? So in the US, there was also a controversy about funding and which groups should be represented. Some called for a focus on Jewish specificity, while others pushed for a broader recognition of other victims and even rescuers. The Armenians, for example, pledged $1 million donation in hopes of including the Armenian genocide in the museum. This led to a big diplomatic kerfuffle with the Turkish ambassador warning that relations with Israel could be affected. Similarly, in Canada, there were debates over whether a Holocaust museum should be built. These debates, mostly between Jews and Ukrainians. Ukrainians being a large minority community in Canada and being, how shall I say, very nationalistic for all kinds of reasons. So in the end, they kind of settled on the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Okay, very controversial, they're very interesting things. So to wrap up things, I want to offer a few ideas on how we as observers may move forward from here. So first of all, I'd like to introduce the idea of memory regimes. This term gives us a helpful lens for understanding the ongoing tension between global universal memory and local particular memory. According to Pierre Nora, memory regimes are the cultural and social practices that define how societies remember their past. Building on this, Redstone and Hodgkin talk about how these memory practices also involve power struggles and conflicts. So the idea of memory regimes isn't just about remembering history, it's about how different groups fight for control over what history gets remembered and who gets to decide what is being commemorated and memorialized. We talked a few times about closure. When we stop talking about these things, we know it's not good. So the conversation about it, the contestation about it, and the debates about it are very important. A second term is that we need to pay attention to how different types of regimes deal with memory. This is especially important as we see political shifts happening around the world. For example, how do authoritarian regimes handle memory? Countries like Hungary or Turkey or some others tend to have more centralized top-down approaches that they can control. Federal regimes have more of a problem, right? I mean, Trump tries hard, Modi tries hard, but it's not so easy, okay? You still have California and New York and all of these things, so it's very complicated. You are not talking about a monolithic, the days when the state had the ability to broadcast on 3 stations, and you tell me the difference between ABC, CBS, and NBC, other than the demographics, I couldn't tell you. And we have moved to narrowcasting, right? Which fragments so nobody has what the Germans call the Deutungshoheit. Nobody can speak, although I still think an administration, a government that has actually the Pravda next to it has more power than I do, right? I mean, they control 5 branches. As a communications scholar, I don't know how you feel about the symbiosis between Fox and this government, but that's serious. That's a serious, you know. Fox is the most successful news thing in the United States. That's real power. Now, if we were to sum up the trajectory of memory politics, another thing again, memory regions. Okay, we had that. Yeah, I want to say a word because, you know, we always I talk about Eurocentrism. The whole idea about memory, the whole idea about transitional justice all started in Latin America. We talked about Desmond Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was taken either from Bolivia or Paraguay, I don't remember. People forget that, obviously also, and it was of course given a very strong theological twist. I was a little surprised that we didn't talk more about Desmond Tutu's influence, right, because it's basically amnesty yes, amnesia no, at the same time the trope of forgiveness, which was obviously serving a particular group in South Africa, was very, very helpful in that respect. So, if we sum up the trajectory of memory politics, the 20th century, and I'm sorry, I'm a sociologist, I'm awful with generalizations, but I hope they kind of help a little bit. The 20th century was the age of national commemorations, right? The nation state, and focused on national identities and histories, heroism, all of that. The early 2000s, that was the age of cosmopolitan decommemoration, where we started questioning and rethinking what we remember, toppling this, toppling that, and all of that. And now we're in a space where recommemoration is evolving into somewhat more exclusive, even discriminatory. I'm pretty sure that if I were Trump, first remove all of us and the things that we have put up, but then I'm going to put up my own stuff. Okay, I mean, this is culture wars. The right wing today is Gramscian. They have understood, they have read, not they, but Bannon has read Gramsci. They know what it means. Bannon is an openly declared Leninist, as he says. You know, I mean, so they're doing it. I mean, my interpretation is they're doing that. Bannon, who I think is one of the main ideologues of this, is doing. On the one hand, is destroying the state, the culture war, and then a touch Carl Schmitt, us versus them. Those are the three, I think, kind of ideological progenitors of what we are going to see in the next 4 years. So that's going to be an interesting time, but frankly, I'd rather not be interested. To wrap up with a cautionary note and an inspirational thought, very unlike me, the rise of neo-nationalism, which pushes back against cosmopolitan ideas, threatens to deepen divisions in our societies. If we don't address this growing polarization, it could undermine the democratic principles, right? And we are very fearful. Everybody talks about the fear for democracy. So my hope is that we can find a way to reconcile cosmopolitanism and nationalism, or maybe nationhood. I should say the ism behind the national really doesn't sit well with me, rather than seeing them as opposing forces. This might be a high order, however, it's definitely something that can be accomplished in the commemorative realm. Let me just quote you from the ICOM, which is not an insignificant place for how museums, and by the way, what's also interesting, curators, museum people, they know the language we're talking. Not that they necessarily read us, but they are familiar with these things. They sit in these meetings and they have these conversations, the better ones, I would say. So I'm not an expert in museum studies. However, the International Council of Museums, also known as ICOM, has a definition of a museum that at least potentially moves us in this direction. And I quote, "A museum is a not-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. Open to the public, accessible and inclusive, museums foster diversity and sustainability. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities offering varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing." Just because Obama, Trump, and many other autocrats don't abide by that doesn't mean that this is not a powerful way of doing it. People are doing it right now. And undoing things takes a lot of effort. You don't just topple it. So, by bringing both of these things together, I want to end on a hopeful note, namely that we can perhaps help curb the extremes and move towards more inclusive and connected societies. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
So my question is thinking about cosmopolitanism as a phenomenon from the perspective of the rejection, right? Because, and I know you don't want to make normative claims, so I won't force you to do it. But thinking about it, there seems to be a high degree of the sorts of things that Owen Flanagan talks about in his book, The Geography of Morals, where he says sometimes when we have moral systems, there are smashdowns where the system in power just enforces their particular view on things. And you can cry about it all you want, but we've got all of the power, so this is now the thing. And I think the claim, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this, because the claim of people on the right particularly is that the cosmopolitanism became a smashdown, where the more local movement wasn't allowed to flourish anymore because you had to abide by the tenets of cosmopolitanism. And really, the emergence of the populist moment we're in is seen as a smart move here, where we'll just adopt the tactics of the enemy, and then we'll do the smashdown. So I'm curious what you think about that, particularly as a reactive phenomenon, right? Do they have a point? Did the cosmopolitanism become so overriding that it was functionally nationalist in its own way, nationalist in a globalist way, if that even makes sense? Do they have a point, I guess is my question.
Yeah, normatively speaking, in response to you, no, personally, I think they do not have a point, because if you think about what we keep saying, the basic values and so on and so forth, you want to dispute the values that, who is willing to say today that people are not equal? Many people think that, but who is willing to say that? So you can say, well, that's terrible, you can't speak your word. I don't want them to speak their word. No, so the point of, look, the Ten Commandments, clearly a very important document in its religious context, but also in the way it has been secularized. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Are we going to throw out the Ten Commandments because adultery is probably more prominent than marriage? No, right? And the same, I think, is true also for human rights. Just because, look, there were times when, and I think Trump is actually an outlier, not that I like the other autocrats, I don't, but he is something, I don't know, I haven't completely, I mean, it's really very different. Not very different, but not the norm in that sense. When, how should I put this? At the time of the Iraq War, remember waterboarding? My point is, I'm repeating basically the same point. Even the torturer has to abide by the human, and abides by the human rights rhetoric. They didn't say, we need to do this for social security. They said, no, this is not torture. Right? The torturers were there saying, you know, and then of course, people said, no, this is not so convenient to be waterboarded, but you know, that was the idea. So everybody has to talk the talk. Now you're telling me, but is that not a form of oppression that people? No, I'm not. But in that sense, I guess I have to confess, I'm a cosmopolitanist, a universalist, and I believe in human rights. And now we can have a conversation, and you can say you don't. I mean, you know, no. I mean, that would be my answer. So what can they do? That's the problem also with the normalization of so many things they say. I mean, Trump is exceptional, and the other autocrats are it's very important for them to play according to the Rechtsstaat. You know, they invent laws. I mean, they're BS, but they invent laws. Here, they don't even pretend. I mean, it's a basic value that goes out the window. And the other autocrats and dictators don't do that, including, I mean, no, China, they can do whatever they want. No, we don't do anything with the Uyghurs. We would never do any. These are education, and we help them. So even those people, you can't say it anymore. That's a form of, you know, restricting somebody's space. But I'm glad that they're restricted. But that's a normative point. That's not something I can necessarily defend on broader terms. I don't know if that makes sense.
I'm curious about a gulf between analysts and critics of memorials and memorializers. Because when I hear that it is a problem with memorials, that they are too univocal in their points, and that they need to be more inclusive and more expansive, and those, I just think psychologically, what memorializer would ever be motivated to create a memorial that was endlessly open to reinterpretation and didn't send a singular moral lesson into the future? It seems like that's the whole purpose of a memorializer. So what you're describing, you know, makes sense for critics of memorials, but I can't imagine someone who was motivated to create a memorial would want to try to accomplish this, because they would probably see it as watering down the purpose of their memorial so much that it would be pointless.
Yes, because memorials are time-bound. So I think we were that close to doing that, and many places are still doing it, and that is exactly the idea of not removing, but contextualizing, right? So here, because we are, at least until recently, the post-terrorism and all of that commanded people. It's also a generational thing to do exactly this kind of polysemic and multiple meanings and so on and so forth. The encoding, if you want, of the memorializer is actually done so that you can also have an opposite reading, not just a preferred dominant reading, right? In the old days, clearly, that is what it is, and if that doesn't accomplish it, then we did something wrong, the memorializer. But that's not longer the case. Curators and memorializers said, no, this should be open. I mean, based on historical facts, preferably, but I'm not encoding this a particular way. You read this as you want, and if you know, I mean, you take the Meredith statue, okay, I go by there, and let's say I have a negotiated reading. I think, what does it mean? I'm an academic, I can do this, blah, blah, blah. And I'm a white frat boy and go by, and I have an oppositional reading, because what is that? Or let's say I'm African American, and you don't have to be any of these things to have that position. I have a little bit of an issue with the left and this kind of epistemic privilege thing, but that's on a side note. And you can say, wow, this is wonderful. So that's open no matter what, but beyond that, now I think this is a self-conscious thing on the part of curators. It has become self-conscious, so you're asking this is a complete turnaround of what the memorial once should have accomplished. And let's face it, memorials emerged really in the context of war death in modern times. It's not a coincidence. Nationalism, war death, celebrating, and so. Now we're dealing with something else. And I guess here I'm very much influenced by Ulrich Beck, that we are in a very self-reflexive moment. Professionals, not just academics, okay? Now, despite the resistance to it. I guess I'm more of an optimist than I thought.
In looking at how you paint the history of these shifts in life and understanding, I see as being this dance of power. And I guess my question and concern, not that you have it, but what do we have to protect us from simply being abused by whoever has the power in the moment? Because the way you describe it is like, okay, so the Cosmopolitan, they had power for a while. And like you were describing, like they did what they did. Neo-nationalist power, we pray they don't do everything they say they're going to do. This is what it is right now. Next person. What do we have to hold on to within memorials, within society, within these movements to protect us from power?
It depends where you live. I'm sorry to say. No. I don't have a comprehensive answer to that. In some places you don't have an option, but in many places you do. And the options are getting more limited, and they're getting smaller in many places, but I don't think we are powerless. Just because somebody tells us we can't do this or that anymore doesn't render us powerless. I don't think, and conversely, what kind of power did we have before? And I'm not minimizing. You have, of course, have a good point. It's very challenging. That's, for instance, why when you go to memory conferences and you have Eastern European colleagues there, and they talk to Americans and Western Europeans, they have something. They used to have something at stake. We are too young to remember this, and they have a completely different, and they're very kind of conscious about it. Okay. And now we also do that because we are heritage, genealogy, all of these things have taken on a whole new meaning. They have exploded in a good way, I think. Local histories, I don't think have ever been as strong as they are now. Even oral history, I'm told, occasionally makes it into a history department. So I don't know, and there is that thing, what is it called? Elections that made also, maybe we still have them and we can do something about that. I don't know. I know that's a vague answer. I really don't know.
I know you had a lot of disclaimers. Yeah. So I like to know, what's your thoughts on, I know you can't see into the future either, but with the way things are going now with the current administration, what's your thoughts on how will it go? I mean,
not well.
What's some of the, pardon me?
Not well. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, but that's really it. I just wanted to know your viewpoint with everything that you know. What's your viewpoint on that? And you answer it. Thank you. I agree.
I'm reluctant to talk about this administration because I think, as I said before, it's such a weird thing. I feel much better talking about real dictators. I mean that facetiously, in the sense that you know exactly how they operate and what goes and what doesn't go. You're not going to put a memorial for the Tiananmen Square in China. You know that. That's it. Okay, very clear. So there's a repression, and that's the beauty of, I'm sorry to say, of democracy. If people are indeed believing in democracy, then there are no grounds to do these things. Certainly not today, when diversity and inclusivity is not just a rhetoric, but very much a fact of most societies, in all society. I mean, short of, I don't know, the Swiss and, not even the Swiss, what am I talking about? Very few homogeneous societies are left, and because of demographics, sorry to be so banal, every society will need millions of immigrants. Okay, because natives are no longer willing to do work. So this is not something that what people wish for or not, this is inevitable. Okay, I want somebody to take care of me when I'm in the elderly home. Okay, and demographics are such that right now I want to be able to draw from Social Security. If we don't let immigrants in, there won't be, you don't need Trump. Social Security will evaporate by itself. So what I'm trying to say is they are, my only hope is that they are so much against what is going on that eventually so many people will suffer that they can't take it anymore. The alternative might be a populist from the left. I don't know. I have no idea. But I hope that's my only hope. That's going to be so bad that people will wake up.
So thank you, Daniel. Well, not to cast even more pessimism on this, but I'd be curious your remarks. I share your despair with the current situation, but as cosmopolitanism is being dismantled before our eyes, domestically and globally, the main bulwark or defender of it in the United States, at least, is the universities, or has been. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, the universities are busy capitulating to this administration, either more out of lack of courage or lack of choice than conviction, but nevertheless, this is what worries me, right? I mean, in other words, the administration's politics aren't really a surprise, except with the rapidity with which they're doing this. But the courts and the universities, but really the universities, have been the defender of the cosmopolitan ideal. Now, you've suggested, and here I agree with you, that the left has some burden to bear in terms of taking some blame for dismantling this cosmopolitan universalism. But now, the liberal university is capitulating very quickly. That's my analysis. So I'd be curious what your views are on that. And that speaks to the questions of memorials as well, I think.
Yes, I think I agree with you. And I would say that part of the dismantling of the university was this kind of convenient arrangement for us to let us do what we want to do and impose neoliberalism as a very powerful factor, because some of the things that have been going down predate this, right? I mean, there's an issue. I think the economic man and the central of neoliberalism is a real problem. And of course, neoliberalism is also out of the window, and nobody or very few people can do it due to the power of the Chinese, the American isolationism, and whatnot. What is not. Yes. Oh, yeah. It's, I mean, the end of history, the end of ideology. This is all. I think that's not very relevant. So I ironically, and I've said that before, I think we, the likes of us, in the humanities and social sciences, they're going to take away certain things, but we will not be affected that much. We are way too insignificant for them to do that. Very simple. That's it. And universities, some universities, especially STEM-centric universities, are very much depending on it. And nobody will put up a fight. I'm convinced. I don't see anybody. Nothing. I mean, they will all fight for the money that is there. I mean, it's amazing how a president who wants to make America great again is setting the foundation for the decline of the American empire. If I'm using that rhetoric, huh? But give me the American empire in its strength with all its terrible deeds on the side, but at least paying lip service to democratic values. And by the way, I don't think it's about cosmopolitanism as much as it's really about humanism and human rights and basic values that, I'm sorry to say, come out of the Enlightenment that we have all imbibed. It doesn't matter, maybe we have an intellectual issue with it, but de facto there's no difference among many of us, either on the left or in the center or so on and so forth. So that's what we're defending, a democracy, I think. Yeah.
So I actually was going to just thank you for this particular slide. But I do have a question, and I want to go back to the idea of a memory regime that you raised. That's a really interesting idea. And I don't know if you've read anything by Alistair McIntyre, but he's a ethicist. This is wonderful. Because I was seeing elements of some of your argument in here that sound Machiavellian to me in some ways. And so for all of your desire to not go normative, there is, I think, in the idea of the memory regime, something really interesting, which is normative, which is to look at those localized structures and to evaluate the practices and the habits of those communities for the norms that they have, and to think about that as being a system. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you're thinking of those memory regimes and what it is, because I'm thinking of the guidance for all of the different memorialization projects that folks have in the room, what kinds of things we might look at or consider for practices that would be useful in thinking about that as a regime. Because when I think of the word regime, it's not a positive term, right? So,
well, regime in the sense that it commands a certain normative and political attention.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, so if you can say more about that, I'd love it.
Yes, I think I have two answers. I'm actually trying to get out of the memory field, but just when I wanted to get out, you called me, so I can't get out. I'm being facetious, but I'm working on solidarity now, which is adjacent to, but obviously not the same. And so this is the context in which I've read McIntyre. And I think there's locality, but I'm a big, normatively speaking, opponent of communitarianism. I think it's exclusionary. Everybody who has read Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, it's a really insidious, in my view, work, because, and that's something we don't speak about when we talk about solidarity. Every solidaristic act is predicated on exclusion. Okay, human rights was a particular moment, but that also, who's the enemy? It's not, if humankind is one, then who's the enemy? So, in other words, I really, I admire McIntyre as an intellectual, as a philosopher, but his communitarianism, I am not so sure about. And for the second question, I have to thank Janet, because her, I do have an answer for you, believe it or not, that I think addresses some of the complexities that we have talked about, and that is, while I was listening to you, it occurred to me that I really have to reread Edward Casey on memory. He makes a very interesting distinction, which I think is very important to us, both in practical terms, but also in analytic terms. And he distinguishes between personal, habitual, and collective memory. Okay? And that is a very, so if you are a memorial builder or something, you can think on these three registers. Okay, habitual. You remember, how often have we said in this conference, oh, people just walk by and don't pay attention, or people walk by and know what it means. That's very powerful. That's also embodied. That's not something you reflect on, that comes automatically. It's a habitus of sort. Personal, I have different things than you have, and whatever or not. Okay, that's important. And collective is what essentially, collective is the one who has the power to kind of push particular ideas. During nationalism, it was nationalists, which was a progressive idea for a moment, very small moment. and so on and so forth. So I think that distinction can somewhat, maybe one can expand it, but can be helpful in some of the, how should I say, conundrums and problems with complexity. I don't think we should be afraid of complexity. I also don't think if we can't represent it, then we can't. We just say it's complex, and these are the points. But thinking about along these three registers might help us a little bit. That's Edward Casey. That's not me. But I just thank you for that.
Well, we're officially out of time, so please join me in thanking